Good afternoon, everybody, and it's wonderful to see such a great group here. My name is Jeannie Hay, and I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and we are really happy to be one of the sponsors of tonight's event, which brings Paul Loeb to our campus. I just wanted to remind everybody that Dr. Loeb's books are available for purchase over in the corner here, and he said that poor students get a special discount rate. So pull out your shirt tail, put some dirt on your face and see how well you can do. I also want to recognize the Center for Civic Engagement and especially Dr. Sam McReynolds, who organized this wonderful event. It's the best thing about universities is that we have engaged discussions and conversations with some of the thought leaders of our community like we are here tonight. So with that, thank you again for being here. Thanks for the pizza. And this is, now I'd like to introduce Dr. Sam McReynolds, Chair of the Department of Society, Culture, and Languages. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you, folks, for coming out tonight. I want to be brief, but there are a few things I would like to say, a little housekeeping. Again, remind you of the books to the back, but also there's pizza and water here. Please eat that up. I would also like to thank Dean Hay, Rick Peterson of the Department of Environmental Studies, and also Richard Anderson Martinez of what used to be the Diversity Office, but I can't get my mouth wrapped around what it is now, and I apologize. Erica tried to coach me on it, but I'm not coachable. And thank you for your generous support in making this happen. I also want to thank Theo Dunfey. I saw her somewhere just a moment ago in the back. This was Theo's idea, and Theo did a lot of logistics connected with Paul, and I really thank her. I also want to thank the others of our staff for the good work that has been done to make this possible tonight. I also want to remind you that Paul's talk tonight is really the kickoff for something really exciting, and that is the first UNE Day of Service. Our office is going to be sponsoring on April the 9th, really starting on April the 8th. We're going to have a 36-hour day of where we are hoping to bring 500 UNE students into the community to do work at about 30 sites. And if you haven't heard about it, please contact our office. We'll be contacting all of you. We encourage you to sign up to do it. We think this is going to be a special opportunity for the university and the community, and we really encourage you to participate. Even those of you who are not part of the university community, we certainly welcome you to participate as well. And that's on April the 9th. We'll be hearing more about that in the press and through UNE emails. Now, it's with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce Paul Loeb, who I've been a fan of for many, many years. Paul has spent more than 3 decades researching and writing about citizen responsibility and empowerment, exploring the questions of why some people choose lives of social commitment while others abstain. He's written 5 books, including The Soul of a Citizen, which I have here and will quote from in just a moment, but this is also in the back. Also, The Impossible Will Take a Little While, Generation of the Crossroads, Apathy and Action in the American Campus. In 2008, he founded the Campus Election Engagement Project, a nonpartisan effort that helps colleges and universities engage their students with political elections. He's lectured at more than 400 colleges, including Stanford, Dartmouth, Chicago, MIT, Yale, my alma mater, Cornell, Duke, Columbia. He has been interviewed on countless TV networks. If you can think of one, he's been interviewed on it. And I thought I would lead into Paul by quoting from his book, The Soul of a Citizen. The problem is every page, and indeed every paragraph, is not only quotable, but inspirational. And so I just want to give a short quote to sort of set the tone for what Paul will be bringing us tonight. Paul writes, listening to those we disagree with doesn't mean letting go of our sense of outrage and urgency or our ability to act. When our hearts cries out against injustice, it's wise to pay heed. But we would do well to cultivate a bit more humility. To hear the souls of others requires silencing the clamor of our own obsessions and our own assumptions about how the world should be. Only when we truly listen to those who we don't share our beliefs do we get the chance to discover and celebrate what we actually hold in common. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Paul. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I've had a really full day. Can people, is this picking up? Yeah, it is. Okay. I've had a really full day here, and sort of going nonstop with these just great discussions in classroom and then classroom and classroom. So, so my energy may be a little bit lower than sometimes, but I'm then buoyed by all the folks here in the room, and so then that brings it back up. So what I want to do is just to talk about something very seemingly straightforward, but I think a little bit more complicated, which is how do we, as just ordinary citizens, live in the times we're living in a way that actually tackles some of these big problems and maybe tackles a piece of them and moves things forward. And I don't have to tell you about all the problems. I mean, the corruption of politics by money, climate change, the widening economic divides. I mean, there's a lot to take on, debt for anybody pretty much who's a student. And I think it's very easy and very tempting to sometimes just retreat to a sort of private self and say, look, I've got a lot on my plate. I'm trying to get through, finish school. I may have an outside job. Maybe I've got a family, just on top of that. And just kind of leave it up to somebody else. And it's also tempting to sort of feel like, I'm not qualified to take these issues on. The magnitude of them is so large. How do we crime, what just happened in Brussels, or, and I thought about it, then I realized that earlier this year, horrible tragedy in Brussels, these people who died, the 3,000 people died in heat waves in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. That barely even made the news. But obviously, an even greater magnitude human tragedy. How do we even think about that? Or do we just say, can't think about it, hope somebody solves it. And what I find, though, is that when we do jump in, we tackle pieces and we put them together with other pieces, and sometimes history does begin to change. But I think we need to know how to act, and often we don't. So I often use the story of Rosa Parks because it's a story that everyone thinks they know, but most people actually don't. And I raised it in the classes a couple times today, and people know mostly, few did know it, what I call the sort of standard version, which is here's this woman who's just so much more impossibly heroic than any of us could be. She's up there on the pedestal. And one day, she refuses to move to the back of the bus. And things instantly change. And she kind of does it all on her own. And she does it sort of on a whim because her feet hurt. And boom, that's the start. The civil rights movement starts. And when you actually unpack it, it's more complicated. No less courageous on her part, but she's interwoven with a whole community. So she's the secretary of the NAACP chapter in Montgomery, Alabama. And she's doing these, I would call them not particularly glamorous tasks. They're all doing these not particularly glamorous tasks. Getting people to come to a meeting, getting people to come again, getting people to continue even when things look like they're just not really moving. And that community includes others, like there's a guy named E.D. Nixon who was a union organizer. There was the people who carried the suitcases on the trains. They call them the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It was a largely African-American union. And he worked for that and was the head of the NAACP chapter in Montgomery. And he was the person who got a young and very reluctant Martin Luther King involved. And it's interesting because we would expect King, because he's king, to be at the forefront of anything. And if there's going to be a cause, certainly Martin Luther King is going to join in. But that wasn't quite how it was at first. And he gave excuses, and he said, I'm new here in town, which is true. I'm young. He was 24, just right out of divinity school, first congregation. People don't really know me. I'm still learning the territory. So these were all had elements of reality, but they also were rationalizations. And there's a phrase that I use in Soul of a Citizen called the perfect standard, which the notion is that to be able to take a stand, you need to know every single 17th decimal point fact and figure. Every answer, you have to be the right point in your life. You have to be just the combination of King Gandhi, Wonder Woman, Superman, Mother Teresa, I mean, you name it, on and on and on. Somebody nobody could ever be, without any doubts, without any hesitations, without any confusion. And that's never the territory that we work in. So King himself was sort of succumbing to that perfect standard when he made these excuses. You know, it's not the right time in my life. I got to wait. I'm too young. And then Nixon was the person who cajoled him and said, you know, you have to. And eventually he gave in and participated, and that's where the world first heard of Martin Luther King. So one of the things that gets erased is community, all those other people, known and unknown, who help make something possible. Second is what I call intentionality. So Parks didn't just, you know, oh, I guess I'm just going to take this stand today. I mean, it wasn't preordained that day. That is, she hadn't planned it out in advance. But she'd been taking training sessions at a place called Highlander School in Tennessee, still going this day. She'd met with an earlier generation of civil rights activists. King went through Highlander as well after he got involved. And she was part of a movement making strategic judgments. In fact, were two young women from the NAACP youth section, which she advised, who earlier on, not too long before, had refused to move to the back of the bus, and they decided to wait to build the campaign around a sort of, quote, pillar of the community. So very much in the air. In the moment that she acted, she knew that she was going to launch a campaign. Didn't know how it was going to turn out. Obviously no idea that it was going to light as great a spark as it did, but knew that she was going to try, and that people would organize, and then who knows what would happen. And when I look at that, I think that when you're acting for change, you need two things. You need what I call a leap of faith. Jim Wallace from the Christian social justice magazine Sojourners says, hope is believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. And I really love that phrase, because it's just, you know, here it is, absolutely impossible. You know, we're not going to tackle campaign finance reform. We're not going to tackle climate change. We're not going to, I mean, how could you take on these huge powers that be? But somehow you do, and some of the time you win. So you need that. But then next to it, you need intentionality, which is just it's the practical. So I run this campus election engagement project that we worked with about 300 schools in 2014, and are on track to do something like that again. And our goal is to get students engaged in elections. And I'll talk about a little bit more some of the issues, but from my vantage point, it's a lot of practicalities. It's like, okay, well, what does that mean? It means helping people register, helping them navigate. We get the schools to do it, so helping them navigate the voting laws, helping them learn about candidates and issues, helping them turn out of the polls. And each one of those is broken down as like, okay, you want people to register? Well, you could, you know, do it at classroom registration. If you're a residential school, you could do it in the dorms. You could do it when you have first year orientation. I mean, lots of ways to do it, but you sort of have to map it out, and we create guides to doing that, and then help the schools follow it out. And so you go from the sort of lofty abstraction and the goal to in the weeds trying to make things work. And that's true with any kind of cause and any kind of campaign. In the case of the bus boycott, it meant working with just getting people to work. You have a poor community. Most of them take the bus. A small number have cars. You got to set up carpools. You know, this is before, you know, forget cell phones, before computers, before, you know, you're doing this all by hand. You've got to coordinate this over an entire community that's boycotting the buses. And you've got to respond when they try and, you know, the cops start following, and, oh, you've got a broken taillight, and they pressure somebody to drop the insurance coverage, so you find the insurance broker. I mean, all these practicalities. And so being practical, being intentional, doesn't mean you know how things turn out, and it doesn't mean that you have to wait till everything's perfect. It just means that you plan as best you can, and then you see what happens. And it's always going to be messy. I mean, I remember somebody working on helping run the sort of field director of our election project. He was a really good planner, came up with some best ideas. And at one point, this is in 2014, he says, everything's going differently. We've planned everything out and it's all going differently. And I said, yep, that's the way things are. They're always going to go differently. It's never going to be exactly what you anticipated, but you do the best you can. So I think that aspect of intentionality drops out of the story if you think that Parks just kind of did it on a whim. Then the other aspect that drops out is what I call perseverance, just plain keeping on. How do you continue on when it's tough? When you just feel like you're not making any progress? When the ball rolls back down the hill? How do you do that? Not easy. So if Parks, though, had given up in it was 12 years from her first NAACP meeting to the stand on the bus, she'd given up in year 10, we'd never have heard of her. So how do you manage to keep going even when it's hard, even when it's frustrating? Because, it always will be. And so I think that the reason I cite that is because I think in the absence of knowing those stories, the lessons drop away. I mean, just show of hands, how many, before I told it in an earlier class, because I see a few familiar faces, how many people knew what I would call the core of the real Rosa Parks story? So not every detail, but just, the core of it. So about, how many students? Let's just go with that. Okay, so, fewer, a chunk, which is great. But somehow, I would argue that for the rest of you folks, that the education up to here has let you down by not conveying that. Somehow conveying the story without conveying the heart of it. And to me, that's really a tragedy. So, one of the lessons is learn from those models of history because they're transferable. I mean, people here are working to try and get the school to divest from fossil fuels. To me, that's an important goal. I mean, it's hard. It means a little bit of shift from business as usual. It means that you've got to overrule that investment advisor who said, that's just the way things are done. But these are huge stakes. So, you have that goal, and then you persevere, and then you know that, and you learn that, and this is one of the models for that particular campaign, that the last previous sort of campus community divestment campaign that sort of caught fire all around the country was around the South African apartheid movement. And that, people had the same arguments. It's not going to make any difference, it's just a drop in the bucket. The usual kind of cynical responses. And yet people, and it was driven primarily by students. There were cities as well that divested, but a lot of it was on campuses. I remember there was one star, Ohio State. I think he was a sprinter and a football player both, but he was like the star athlete on campus and he refused to run and play. And it was just like, you have to. No, I don't. And if you're an athlete at that level, you've worked really hard to get there. And so to give up the chance to compete or defer it is not something you do lightly, but it was a profound moral stand, and I think people recognize it as such, and it galvanized the community. And sometimes you don't know what's going to happen out of that. I was talking earlier on and mentioned that, just kind of curious, again, for folks, not excluding folks who were in one of the earlier sessions, do people know where Barack Obama got his political start? Anybody? Well, here's the story. And this, to me, is a relevant story, whether you think Obama was a great president, a terrible president, an in-between president, or wherever it is on the continuum. The lesson is larger than any of his policies. So there was a Green Beret who went to Vietnam and came back disillusioned with the war, a guy named Gary Chapman. And he started he came back to a community college, transferred to a private college named Occidental, about the same size, maybe a shade larger than UNE, but about the same size, and started an anti-apartheid group on campus. And they got the support of the Student Senate and then the Faculty Senate. And then the trustees and the president just like refused to consider it. And he graduated, and you could say, he failed, didn't have an impact. But some other people carried it over to the next semester. And a young man from Hawaii comes as a student, and his name is Barack Obama. And he gets involved peripherally, meaning, at the edge, not the main organizer, not the person driving it, but, he does a few things. And then looking back, sort of sees that as a kind of turning point in his life that led him to the community organizing in Chicago and eventually to the White House. And again, this is much larger than, whether he's a good president or a bad president. This is about the fact that had those people not launched that movement, continued it, maybe you never would have had him on his political path at all. And imagine if somebody who's like a future president is sitting there in a classroom, residence hall, but only if you motivate them. And I think of that because I call it it's sort of the law of we talk about laws of unanticipated consequences. It's a law of unanticipated consequences from bringing somebody into a movement. And I first thought of it when I was putting together the book The Impossible Take a Little While, and Václav Havel was a leader of the Czech democracy movement against the communist dictatorships. And he was later on the president, but at that point he was somebody who was in and out of jail, and there was a moment where he was out of jail and he was trying to get some support on a petition to free some people who were in jail. And the effort failed, and he was looking back on it about 7 years later, and this was 3 years before the Berlin Wall fell and 3 years before the dictatorship in Czechoslovakia nonviolently fell, kind of all across Eastern Europe. And he was thinking about the fact that he tried this and it just hadn't worked. And he's like, well, is it futile? I mean, maybe you're just like bashing our heads against the wall. He said, no, it was really important because these were courageous people and they needed to know that they weren't alone. Because that's, when we talk about perseverance, knowing that you're not alone is really key. That's why you've got to have the good, the 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever it is, people who can keep each other going. In fact, I remember when Nelson Mandela was in prison in South Africa along with his compatriots, and they're basically saying, you're just going to rot and die there. And 27 years is, it's an awful long time. And they would do things to remember, to keep their hope up. So they would be to remember they weren't alone. They would be breaking rocks in a prison courtyard and somebody would just start whistling a freedom song. Or they would be denied newspapers to isolate them, and somebody would see the guard would have a newspaper used to wrap his tuna fish sandwich, and you eat the sandwich, throw it in the trash. They'd kind of grab it from the trash, see a story that might inspire each other, and in a kind of tiny coded script on toilet paper, only kind of paper they had, they would pass it cell to cell. So that sense of not being alone. But then so it was important to remind people that. The other thing, though, Havel said, was that when the people started signing these petitions to free the prisoners, and other people were saying, it's not going to make any difference, why are you even bothering? That was their first step to speaking out, but it wasn't their last step. So they would go on and put on speak out in plays, in the classrooms, play dissident music, in the churches, every aspect of the society. And Havel said, there's so many people now, this is again still under the dictatorship, they can't jail us all. Before they could, because there are just a few of us. And so what he reminded me is that when you're doing something, even if it's hard, that the people you bring in, you don't know where they're going to go. And they could come up to be, the next president, the next powerful leader 30 years down the line, 10 years down the line. And to me, it's really important. I remember there was a young woman who I write about named Angie DeSoto, who was, I guess to say that she started school as politically disengaged is kind of an understatement. So I asked her, she went to Virginia Tech, 32,000 person school in Richmond, Virginia. And Virginia's a swing state during any election. It's just one of those narrow razor edge states. So people are campaigning there a lot. And she happened to be in the 2004 election, it was when she was a freshman. And I said, well, were you at all involved? You'll see why in a little bit. And she said, no, I didn't think who was president had anything to do with my life. And then she was just kind of embarrassed. And then she got really embarrassed. And she says, well, actually, we did a drinking game. So she said, we divided into the girls on my floor, we divided into random red teams and blue teams, red for Republican, blue for Democrat. And when a state went red, the red team would chug a beer. And when a state went blue, the blue team would chug a beer. And as you know, there are 50 states. This is a lot of beer. So by the end of the evening, they're just like, they're on the floor. I mean, they're not even, forget knowing who's president. I mean, they're lucky to know their names. And so this is where she starts, not the most engaged. So how do you get from there? Well, she was in a big geology class, 300 people, and the prof starts talking about climate change. And it was kind of a risk because if describe it, I mean, geology is relevant to climate change in the sense that some of the climate record are things like ice core samples and stuff like that. But compared to the other sciences, it's a little bit at the periphery. But he said this isn't about the test. This is about the future. What's going to be happening? So she said, just listen. Don't be dutifully taking the notes to memorize. Just listen. And he just sort of mapped it all out. And here are these, every scientist in the world, every scientific body. I mean, the American Chemistry Society is not a radical body. It's just like they're seeing this. It's real. It's urgent. And then there's this tiniest handful of scientists who deny it, who oddly enough turn out to be the same ones who are working for the tobacco companies, saying there was no link between smoking and cancer. And when we had something called, it was the ozone hole, where the CFCs that kind of propelled spray cans were destroying this protective covering against ultraviolet light. And it was something that was just, it turned out the solutions to that were pretty simple and quick and inexpensive, but they denied that. And now they're denying, with the same PR firms, the same approaches, trying to cast doubt on the human drivers of climate change. And so talking about stuff like that, and talking about just the science of it, and she didn't know any of this, so she's just stunned and doesn't know what to do, and kind of is too intimidated to talk to the professor. So she just reads for a few months, and then she runs into a tiny environmental group. When I say tiny, meaning like 4 people on a campus of 32,000, and just. They're trying to do green fees, which is to use a little bit of student fee money for making the place physically more sustainable. And they probably, to be honest, weren't the greatest organizers, or there would have been more than 4 of them. But they did have persistence. And so they're out there just, approaching people. And Angie was like, God, I found my tribe. And she jumps in, gets involved, starts organizing. She does summer. She works for the Pergs. I'm not sure there's a Perg in Maine or not. Is there Pergs in Maine? No, but there are in Massachusetts, MassPerg, that does a lot of door-to-door organizing and stuff on campuses as well. And she said, I learned that you knocked on 20 doors, 20 people said no, 21st person thanked you, and that made it all worthwhile. And she gradually built this coalition. She built the group itself into I think it was 1,300 members on their listserv. So it was the largest student organization of any kind on campus, political or not. She built a sustainability coalition with other student organizations that extended as far as the campus Young Republicans. She got peer education in the dorms around education sustainability. And they got originally the president, when there were 4 people, even if it's a really good group, it's really hard for the president of a 32,000 person university to meet with a 4-person group. But when there are 1,300, I mean, no brainer. And so goes in and basically convinces him to get behind this comprehensive sustainability initiative. And they spend, I can't remember what it was, I think 6 months just learning from what all sorts of other campuses did, and what are the light fixtures, what's the campus transportation pool, are the carpets sustainable? There's a company called Interface that probably made these because they're carpet squares, and that was what they developed. That has, you see over the years, it's about probably 15-year process where their inputs for energy, raw materials, water, every possible environmental input just drops, and their profitability goes through the roof, and their global sales, and it's like a huge. I think it's the 2nd biggest commercial carpet company in the world, and they pioneered the idea of squares because if you're, how to describe it? Well, say you're walking through this room, this quarter is going to get worn out really quickly, and over there, it's never going to get worn out. So that square doesn't need to be replaced, but this one will be, and so stuff like that. Just again, real practical stuff. And Angie was on the committee, and then she was graduating, and this was like 2008, the 2008 crash, and most state schools were in financial crisis, including the ones in Virginia, and they had a hiring freeze. And so the president did an emergency hire, and the emergency was he didn't want to let Angie go. She was just too good, so he wanted to keep her around as sustainability officer for the school and hired her as that. And she said, looking back, she said, I'm a reminder that people can change. She said, I was just a drunken party girl. That was all I cared about. This was a really apathetic school. It's not apathetic anymore. And so she managed to, in some sense, to me, exemplify the fact that here's this person, and you think that they may not be that engaged and that interested, and maybe they aren't, and then something shifts. And there they are, and they're trying to do something because suddenly they recognize. I don't think if it's a lack of caring. I think it's more a sense of powerlessness. And so in part that's the challenge that we face is how do you, in a situation where everything makes you feel, the money dominating our politics, particularly after this horrendous Supreme Court decision, and yet, things can happen. We've got, here in Maine, I wrote about years ago, and somebody's here today, an effort called the Clean Elections Initiative that was a model for all other, for the rest of the country, where people would get $5 contributions, and that they got enough of them, they'd get qualifying money to be able to run a competitive campaign. And I remember it was a Republican legislator who said, before this, I would always have to listen to the donors. That was all, I'd listen to. Now I can listen to my constituents and my conscience. That freed you up from that money. And because, again, of this 5-4 court decision, there's now a Supreme Court vacancy that the next president will appoint, or this Senate will confirm. And, one of the people who struck down parts of that law is now gone. So it's up for grabs. And Maine passed an initiative to strengthen it last fall, and to navigate past these new barriers. And I think, to me, it's indicative of saying, you hit a barrier, you figure out a way to act around it. And it's interesting to me because, I spend most of my time trying to get, as mentioned, schools to get students to vote. And one of the things we're a nonpartisan project and absolutely have to be. But one of the things that I've noticed and I'm somewhat concerned about is that if we look at the primaries and who the students have voted for so far, or who young voters have voted for so far, and we look at the 2 leading candidates right now, there's a mismatch. And about 70% of young voters have voted for candidates other than Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And so one of the serious fears that I have is that people's going to stay home if though, and it's possible the different candidates will come in, but that if it stays that, they'll just, somebody said that in one of the classes we were talking with. And to me, it's dangerous because it's sort of part of the perfect standard, which says if you don't have a perfect situation to act in or a perfect candidate, you stay home and effectively empower that candidate you like least. And people often say, well, my vote doesn't matter. What's one vote? And I remember a couple examples, just pretty personal ones. There was in 2004, I live in Seattle, Washington, and I was knocking on doors for a governor candidate that I supported. And I got 3 people to vote that day. And it wasn't because I was just a skillful persuader, or the master orator, or any of that stuff, or I'd written books. It was basically because I showed up and one forgot that it was election day, which happens, and one needed a ride to the polls, which I had a number that we were able to call, and one had an absentee ballot, and it's like, well, I forgot to mail it. What do I do? And they, in this case, I think I called, and they said, okay, here's what they do. Here's where they can drop it off. And I finished. I wasn't paying that much attention to the Washington governor's race, but that was the easiest place to volunteer. And my candidate won after 3 recounts by 134 votes. It's not very much in a state of 5 million. 134 votes. And I just did the math. And I thought, okay, so that means that in one single day of volunteering, because I'd actually volunteered a few other days as well, I got 1/50th of them. And if 50 fewer people had shown up on my side, my candidate would have lost. If 50 more people had showed up on the other side trying to get out there, because basically, you target the precincts where you got your supporters, trying to get their supporters out, their candidate probably would have won. And it just really brought it home that you just don't know. I just had, we have our very first time we have local district instead of citywide elections for the city council. And a friend of mine was running. She was the chief assistant to another friend who was a longtime city councilman. And she was, the real estate interest dumped in about $200,000 into her opponent. So she was way outspent. But she's a good campaigner. And I remember one point I had agreed to give a house party for her. And I said, I'm pretty strapped on time, but I'll email some friends, and my wife will email some friends, and with luck we'll get some neighbors and some of her work colleagues. And the day came, and we had like 5 people. It was really pitiful, and I'm just like, oh God, I've wasted. Lisa was there, and her campaign manager, and it's like, she could have been knocking on doors, and she's sitting talking to 5 people. And these events are also she sort of hopes to, to stir up energy, but also to raise some money. Nobody had any money at all. She did. I think somebody wrote a $20 check maybe, and that was the sum total for the event. Barely pays for gas. And I was just like, oh, I'm sorry, Lisa. Except there was this one friend of mine who had actually just retired, who had some time. He worked for the school district and just had some time on his hands. And all he did, I think this was like August. From August to November, was volunteer for her. And he just, made phone calls, knocked on doors, talked to voters. He'd asked her a bunch of pretty thoughtful questions. And she ends up winning by 39 votes after a bunch of recounts. And I just like, hey, I'm really glad I threw this house party, because otherwise my friend wouldn't have been volunteering. And had he not been volunteering, we would have had a different city council person. So part of, I think, the chat, and I could give you a bunch of other stories, of the 2000 presidential election. Some really ugly stuff happened in Florida, but the official tally was like 530 something votes. Not very much for, a state of, I don't know what Florida is, like, 18 million people or something. It's a huge state. And, that decided a presidency. And then it wasn't even just Florida, but I think it was, I can't remember the margin in New Hampshire. It was about 1,100 votes. And had Al Gore won that, he could have still lost Florida and it wouldn't have mattered. So you just don't know. And I think that's part of the reason I guess that that I work on this election project is just thinking it's so critical for people, and especially, I mean, this is going to be an ugly election. It already is. It's, and I mean, forget even the whose penis is bigger than whose. I mean, some of it is just There's a movie called Idiocracy, and the person who, it's a good movie, and the person said, "I didn't mean it as a documentary," So it's gotten pretty strange already, but it's going to, by the time the negative ads start flooding in, and Maine's competitive enough that they'll flood into Maine, and by the time the candidates finish attacking each other, it's going to be really tempting to just sort of say, you know what, forget all of them. I mean, I just it's ugly, it's corrupt, I'm staying home. And I think that's a grave mistake because, whoever your values are, whoever you choose, you want to, and it may be mixed. It may be, God, I really have some reservations about this person. But if there's anything, and there will be significant things that differentiate them, you want to get the person who is closer, this is my view at least, to where you stand, wherever you stand, than the person who is further away, because the magnitude of the consequences are so huge. And I think that's a hard lesson, and it may turn out that the candidates end up being the ones who are just delighted with, which is great, in which case you'll still have to push them if they get elected, no matter what, no matter, whether you supported them, whether you didn't, whether they were your second choice. But to me, that this is, as I've, the conversations I had in the classrooms today, conversations in the last couple of weeks in 2 other states, this is my concern, is that people will abdicate. And by abdicating, they will essentially hand the election over to whoever they really like least. And to me, the stakes are just too large. So, so I'll leave you with that on election and then offer one more story, and then we can have some questions. So I've talked a lot about perseverance because it's important, because all of these fights are long haul fights. And, again, it can take a long time. It can be, sometimes something unexpectedly leaps. Sometimes the ball rolls back down the hill. So how do you keep on? And I think a lot about Desmond Tutu, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from South Africa. And think about him a second, what his life is like. So he's a black man growing up in apartheid-era South Africa. And he is told, and then later on his kids are told, he has to tell his kids, you can't go to this park, to this school, to this workplace, to this part of a city. You've got to carry these papers. You've got to step aside. Pretty ugly. I mean, we had stuff like that in our country as well. It was one of the models for apartheid. And, how do you explain this to your kids? I see those King pictures up on the wall. And one of King's speeches, talking about explaining to his kids why they couldn't go to the beach or to the park, or, rips you apart. And he's seeing, as he gets older and he's getting involved in this movement for freedom, he sees friends killed, jailed, tortured, pretty hard. Finally, they do get their freedom, and his Tutu says to the American students who were involved in the anti-apartheid movement, "I want to thank you. We might not have our freedom without you." So it was their struggle, but a kind of global movement as well. And you might think that after all that, he then chairs what they call the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to bring out the most difficult stories of how this whole society is complicit in apartheid, or at least the white part of it is. And so if you committed a crime in the name of apartheid, you had to tell the whole story and who was involved, or else you'd get prosecuted. But if you told it and it was broadcast in every there's, I guess, 3 major languages: English, Afrikaner, and one of the African languages, and on every network for months. Then he would get amnestied. And so Tutu's the hub of this commission, and they're all kind of resting on him emotionally and spiritually. And that's got to be tough. So you would think that he would just sort of say, okay, I've done enough. You know, I'm going to put my feet up. I'm going to go someplace that's really pretty, look at the water, and just kind of relax the rest of my life and retire. But that's not who he is. So he was working Rwanda after these horrendous massacres where people literally hacking each other apart with machetes. And he goes to try and talk about the truth and reconciliation and how a society can come together after horrendous wounds. He's in Haiti as an election observer, and they steal an election, and there are riots, and they bring in helicopters to fly out the observers and for their safety. And he says, I've got to stay here with my people. He was a fierce critic of the war in Iraq, just felt it would be a disaster, and I think we're in part seeing the kind of, including the horrible events in Brussels, the sort of consequences of consequences of consequences when you go in and just sort of blithely assume that you can remake a country from the outside without any thought, and continue to speak out. And then on climate change, he said, there's 3 billion reasons to do that. The 3 billion poorest people in the world really have not created it. It's been the people in the affluent societies. But they're going to bear the brunt of it partly because of the climate zones they live in, and partly because they have the fewest resources to deal with disasters as the disasters unfold. And so you might think from all of that he'd be a little bit downhearted. It's not like he's dealing with easy issues. Again and again, he's taking on, the depths of what humans can do when we're blind. And if you ever see him, though, he doesn't talk. He's traveling less than he used to. It's pretty amazing. The only way I can describe it is he almost sort of floats off the stage. And he's laughing and he's teasing and he's joking. The phrase, I think I've seen him 4 times because he has this, sort of one of his main proteges is I think he's a bishop, Episcopal bishop in Seattle. So he would come through Seattle more than some other cities, and I'd always go see him. And he's joking. And I remember he would always say, use the phrase, he would say, God has a sense of humor. And he would tell a joke, kind of a silly one. I remember he would said, who would think the world would learn anything from South Africa? We're not the brightest country. Our scientists said that they would build a rocket to the sun, and when people pointed out that it would burn up, they said, no, we'll launch it at night. It'll be okay. It'll be just fine. And I remember sitting there laughing with everyone else. And then I got this sort of, I don't know what you call it, judgmental impulse, for lack of a better word. And I'm thinking, well, but why didn't he talk about Nelson Mandela and the freedom struggle, and why is he telling this silly joke? And then I get it. He's reminding us to laugh. He's reminding us that if you're dealing with something really hard, really deadly serious, lives are at stake, you've got to be able to laugh. Because that's what gets you through. And so he tells a joke, and then he goes on to a discussion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'll remember that always. And then I'll also remember the very first time that I saw him. And it was a benefit for a South African project at the home of it was like the wife of one of the producers of The Simpsons. It's a big Hollywood fancy place, and I think somebody got me an invite because they liked my book, and so I was able to come. And he was not feeling well that day, so he's been battling prostate cancer, and he lay down for a nap, gets up, gives his talk, some other people give some talks, and then a band starts playing, and people start dancing. And I look over, and there's Desmond Tutu just having a great time dancing away. And I'm thinking, I've never seen a Nobel Peace Prize winner dance before, much less an archbishop. This is pretty interesting. And I started thinking about that, and what's the lesson? And the lesson is, this is somebody who he is going to embrace every moment of what you'd call the grace of the world, because it's like, if there's good music, well, of course you're supposed to be out there dancing, and good community and jokes and, beautiful nature like what surrounds us here, and life is here to enjoy. And it seems a little bit like a paradox, because, this is the person who takes on all the serious issues. But I would certainly say, I was going to say he's one of the most joyful individuals I've ever met meaning like, I had about 30 seconds with him at one of the events, because everyone else is trying to talk with him as well, and the rest of the time I'm in a huge auditorium listening to him. But there's this joy that comes out of him that feeds his vision of justice. And I think that it's sometimes hard, it's easy to forget that, because you have setbacks. I just in my own work, with a lot of it revolves around raising the funds for our election project, and we get a setback, and we've been working for months on this foundation proposal, and they just sort of give some stupid reason why it doesn't fit, and you're back to square zero. And then we have a phone call, and our team, because we're dispersed around the country, and our team's laughing and they're joking, and they're telling about what they did at this campus and what they did at that campus, and it revives your spirit. So what I would suggest is that you take that as a model, and maybe somebody here will become the next Desmond Tutu on the world historical stage. But I know that some of the folks here will become wonderful stalwart activists, like some of the other people sitting in the room who's been around a while, and will change the communities and change Maine or change wherever it is that you're going back to. And to do that with courage and vision, but to do it with joy as well. That's really important, because if all you see is just that place of what we fear, what we're up against, it does grind us down. And sometimes it's hard to look over that horizon, but I think we have to. And we have to do it, and go back to that Rosa Parks story. You do it in community, you do it with persistence, you do it with that leap of faith, and you do it with that intentionality that says you go forward as best you can. Thanks. I'd love to take some questions.
And just to let you know, if you just hold the button down on the microphones on the tables, you can use those to ask your questions.
Wow, magic. Technology magic. So don't be shy. Well, while you're waiting to formulate the perfect question, I'll tell you about my own perfect standard of asking questions, which is that for years I would be sitting in the audience, and this is after I'd written like several books and everything, and was perfectly comfortable, on a big stage. And if somebody else was on the stage, and I had to ask a question, I would just I've got to get it right. I've got to get, this is a really smart person up there. I've got to make sure that I don't want to ask a stupid question. I don't want to get it wrong. And so I'd be just thinking, well, I could say it, this is what I want to ask, but no, I better say it a little bit differently to make sure they understand what I'm saying. And meanwhile, people would kind of not here to now, but most of the time they'd be lining up at mics, because that's generally the way that at most auditoriums, they've got the mics out and and people line up. And the lines would get a little bit longer. And I noticed something that if they answered 8 questions, I'd be the 9th questioner. Sorry, we were running out of time. And if there was 11, I'd be the 12th. And if it was only 3, I'd be the 4th. And I was like, seems like there's a pattern here. And the pattern was whatever it was, I waited just long enough to not get my question answered. And so I just thought, well, forget that. I'm just going to blurt it out, and the best I can. And so I've been doing that since. It works a lot better. Yeah.
Okay, I'll give this a try. Thank you so much. So my question, so when I think about all the causes that I care about and should be even more active on, the one that's closest to my heart lately is the problem of the maldistribution of wealth in this country. And I just feel like it's in our lives and our faces every single day. But I don't feel a community of activists around which that dedicated to that. And the thing that seems the most obvious to me is the Occupy Wall Street movement, which happened a couple of years ago. But to be honest, and this could be a failing of mine, I didn't really feel like that was one that I either wanted to or felt, I don't know, I wasn't attracted to that. So what are your thoughts both about Occupy Wall Street and maybe something like distribution of wealth isn't sexy or obvious, like maybe global warming is, or some other causes that are more easily captured in a sentence or two?
Well, I think the causes are interwoven. Do people just raise your hands? How many people know what the Occupy Wall Street movement was? So most. When I looked at that movement, I saw it was a kind of contradiction because I thought it was raising exactly one of the really, really, really important issues. And it affects student debt. It affects, it's the fact that just this tiny slice of the top has more and more, and everyone else is just squeezed, and it really damages lives. I remember writing this. It was an article I called Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft. I call it Paul Allen's Other Yacht because I was in Vancouver, and they had a little article in the paper about like his sort of second smaller yacht was in town, and it had 30-person crew and 2 helicopters and a submarine and on and on and on, and 6 swimming pools and screening rooms and on and on. And I was like, God, that's his smaller yacht. What's his bigger yacht like? And I don't begrudge him a few toys, but so I researched online, and it's like his bigger one was like another 50% bigger, 40-person crew, 7 Navy SEALs, former Navy SEALs in case of pirates, 2 submarines, and on and on and on. And then he had 2 747s, I guess in case one was in the shot. And I thought, this is one person. He can only be on one of these vehicles at one time. Why does he need the other ones? I don't know. And I got it ran in some papers, and I got his PR person emailing me. This is after Hurricane Katrina, and they said, well, I just want you to know that he gave whatever it is, some millions of dollars to Katrina relief. And I emailed back and I said, yeah, that's less than 1 year's maintenance on one of his yachts. I'm just not that, I hate to say it, but I'm glad he did it, but I'm really not that impressed because, he could do, so much, he could do so much more. And he had, it's not to pick on him. He's the owner of the football team that I cheer for, so, but still, it's just, I look at it and I think, so Occupy Wall Street dramatized it by sitting out in public squares, Wall Street in particular, but all around the country. And I'm sure there was an Occupy Portland, and it did catch people's attention, and it got people talking, and they did some meta search of the amounts of times that economic inequality and concentration of wealth came up in major media stories, and it went from flatline to up here. So it had an impact. Probably the mayor of New York would probably not have been elected without the issues being raised, and cities passed livable wage laws. And so stuff happened, tangible, real stuff. But I think what that movement did is it had 2 major failings. One was, and they're both in some sense about insularity. One was that it just didn't reach out to allies. It felt like we're reinventing the world here. We know how to do it. Everybody else doesn't. And so, it varied a little bit city to city, but an awful lot of them, it was just sort of like an arrogance that sort of said, we can do it on our own. And you can't. So you've got to go out to, congregations and unions and community groups, and they just weren't doing that. And then they basically became obsessed with holding the physical space and and therefore, fighting the local municipal authorities over the right to perpetually camp. I mean, in Seattle, our mayor was pretty sympathetic and said you can have some space near City Hall, but you can't have this particular square where you've been camping out, which, and they're only a mile away from each other. And they're like, no, we have a right to do this. And so it diffused the energy of the movement. It became focused on, confronting the attempts to dislodge them. And so I think it's a kind of a tragedy that it did fall away. And, perhaps some of the energy of the Sanders campaign is sort of echoes of it, talking about that stuff. And, I would argue shifting the political dialogue. Some of what Trump is talking about resonates to it too, actually. What everyone thinks of him is just, people know in a lot of communities that the die has been stacked, that there was a political theorist named Robert Putnam, who I heard speak at a conference on, Sunday, I think it was Monday. And he's writing a lot about economic inequality and the widening gap, including, he's focusing, there's sort of two gaps. So one is the super rich and everybody else, and the other is the college educated and the high school and the non-college educated gap. And he was looking just with all these charts on, age of death and, the sort of every, drug addiction and every sort of social ill, just sort of the opening up of this gap. And he was contrasting the community that he grew up in, this sort of mostly factory town on the edge of one of the Great Lakes in Ohio. And basically he was describing how the people of his generation, he's in his mid-70s, they all did pretty okay. He went on to college, became like a Harvard professor, fast track. But the person who worked at the local plant, they did okay. But then once it came to their kids, it just started radically diverging. And his granddaughter's two college-educated parents just doing great. The daughter of the son of this other person who was one of his classmates, just once the mills closed down, just marginal employment in and out, drug addiction. The daughter, is 14, is going to have a baby now. It just, everything that you look at and you say, this is really not good. And all those trends dividing just the local, just this community. And he said, one of the things that is a predictor of economic success is like extracurricular activities in high school. Turns out that if you do that stuff, college too, if you do that stuff, something besides your classes, you gain a lot of skills working with people. It doesn't matter whether you're playing on an athletic team, or you're in the chess club, or you're doing debate, or you're in the marching band, or whatever it happens to be. That it just builds a lot of skills. But now he said, when he was there, everybody could do them. Now you have to pay activities fees, and so if you're wealthy or modestly affluent, then you pay the fees. And if you're living on $15,000 a year, you don't pay the fees, and your kid doesn't get to play, and they're in this sort of just social isolation. So it was a pretty grim map. And then towards the end, he basically said, but there was a period they called it the Gilded Age, which is the end of the 19th century, when the gaps were even wider than they were. And I would say he talked about how America kind of pulled things together and invented the universal free high school, which sort of happened during that period, was an example of, an institution that then brought people back together. I think he downplayed a little bit. There were these pretty radical movements out there of these socialists and these populist farmers, and they were challenging stuff. And I think they helped push those other folks who are maybe more middle class, or even affluent, to say, well, we better deal with these problems. So, slight difference of interpretation in that period, but what strikes me is that it is very, very real, and that it's clearly going to take time and effort to solve. And it's about where the resources are distributed and what kinds of things we can do. And there's a lot of alternatives out there. I mean, I remember they would visit these, they call them the Mondragon cooperatives. This is federation of cooperatives in Spain that transformed what was the poorest region in Spain to one of the wealthiest by these sort of interconnected businesses that the bank would lend each other money, and a certain amount of the profits would go back in to start other businesses. And I remember it was a sort of metallurgical smelting plant. I mean, a huge factory. We're taking a tour of, and he said, yeah, there were 4 of us now, and there's like, I don't know what it was like, 1,200 people working here now, and just, I think it takes innovation, it takes cooperation, but it does also take people saying that if you siphon up all that wealth at the top, you're not going to have enough to be able to do the things we need to do. Yeah.
I was just wondering what you thought about Democracy Spring coming up here in the next couple weeks, and how that may be an extension to take Occupy Wall Street, and possibly a better version of trying to address political...
I don't know Democracy Spring. Sorry.
It's a march starting from Philadelphia going to Washington, it's a big event in Washington coming up in D.C.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I obviously can't weigh on it hugely since it somehow missed my consciousness. But I think the key element for something like that to succeed is, I mean, you can dramatize it with the people, arriving in D.C., but to me, it's fundamentally the work in the local communities to say, look, this is what we need to see addressed, and are you going to address it or not? And putting the pressure on the local elected officials and the state elected officials, and gathering enough people so that they can't ignore it. And I think that's true with all of these issues. Yeah.
So I guess my question is, you talked a little bit about the upcoming election and what students and people should do if their candidates are not chosen.
Right.
Which I completely understand that, if I wanted a certain candidate and they didn't get elected, or they didn't win the primaries, I would obviously vote for the other candidate. Right. But what do you think the value is for, say, write-in ballots? Like, how do you think that people who use write-in ballots, how do you think that would impact the election? Do you think it's just as effective, especially for those people who are trying to sort of get a political revolution? Like, do you think that write-in ballots would be effective, or would it still impact negatively?
Yeah. I mean, I don't. So essentially, here's my judgment is that, and it's not, it's write-in ballots, and sometimes you have 3 parties, and a third party, on a local state can win. Nationally, if no candidate gets a majority of electoral votes, it goes to the House of Representatives and probably gets picked by the current House of Representatives. I think the problem with those sort of symbolic statements is that they have real consequences if the person you like least wins. And so you're effectively saying your vote could be stopping that person, or it could have no impact. And to me, I think, given that we're talking about Supreme Court seats, we're talking about who runs the EPA, determines policy, and every federal agency, support, passes programs, dismantles programs. I mean, the stakes are huge. And so I think casting the symbolic vote, to me, is sort of like the wrong venue. So you can have, I mean, well, I'll give an example. We talked about in the environmental studies class, the Keystone Pipeline was going to go through. Everybody knew it was going to go through, and the people were organized on the ground along the route. People sent, like they showed up because Obama. It was basically this pipeline from this disproportionately destructive, even more than normal fossil fuels, tar sands in Canada to actually not even for the U.S. It was basically all going to go to export to the Gulf Coast refineries, and it was a done deal. It was just going to roll through. I mean, they'd had so much money, so much power. Generally speaking, you don't block a project like that. It just kind of a straightforward, yeah, of course it goes through. That's fine if Canada wants to do that. And I mean, I remember this friend of mine in Nebraska, and the Obama administration wasn't making particularly big noises about stopping it. And the first environmental impact statements were written by a company that had ties to the tar sands industry, so they're all kind of sweetheart deals, didn't even mention climate change. And in Nebraska, where the pipeline was going, they bought up like every PR firm, every bit of TV time. They would go to local elected officials, this is a company called TransCanada, local elected officials along the route, and they basically would say, oh, we might want to store some equipment. Could we rent your front yard, back porch, back closet for some outrageous sum of money? I mean, basically bribery, but done in a way that didn't violate any laws. And it was just going to, everybody knew it was going to go through, even the groups opposed to it. And then what happens is people start organizing. A friend of mine had this really radical idea of holding a potluck and gathered some people. They gather some more. They get this rock-ribbed Republican rancher named Randy Thompson, who looks like a cowboy hero action from a movie. And he says they want his land. He's like, I'm not going to be bullied. I'm not going to sell to them. And so they do these life-size cardboard cutouts with him saying, I will not be bullied. And the campaign was, we stand with Randy. And great spokesperson. So it's a cross-political alliance, and people go to as it builds momentum, they go to the White House and get, I think it was 1,100 people get arrested, and they're a lot of them wearing Obama gear, saying, we supported you, and we want you to act. And I remember there was a big football game, Nebraska, the University of Nebraska Cornhuskers, packed stadium. The ad comes on from TransCanada, because of course they'd bought that too, lots of money going around, and it erupts in boos. And like, this wasn't in the game plan. And my friend said, this was like, kind of interesting. She felt like they had a chance, when she heard that. And to me, and then eventually the Obama administration blocked the pipeline. So after just sort of deferring decision for, I think it was 4 times, they kicked it down the road and then they blocked it. And so to me, what that says is, and this is true no matter who's elected, you pressure them. You keep that pressure on. And they may not be somebody who excites you greatly, but if you push that pressure on, and they're at least, their policies are at least somewhat closer to what you have, they're going to be amenable than if they're one that's just totally hostile to what you believe in. And but I don't, so that's to me, that's a real clear logic. I don't honestly know whether, I don't know whether the youth vote will turn out or not. I really don't, depending on the candidates. And it scares me. Yeah.
I know that you've really stressed participation in elections, and with the election that's going on this year, right. I know it's been part of the media that more and more people are participating. So do you think because this election is so polarizing that that's going to have effect on political engagement going forward, even if the person who you're supporting loses?
I don't know. I think it's a really open question. I would like to see that it does. I mean, I would hope that it does. Because a lot of new people have participated, and that is good. On both sides. I just don't know I don't know what will happen. I feel like I often have some handle on it. In this election, I have probably less handle on it than anyone, certainly in my recent memory. There's just so much, there's been so much unpredictability, you know, on both parties, major parties. So, you know, for myself, it's like, all right, I will do what I can, which I know is to help students get out to vote. And that's, you know, that is in my control. And so I think the challenge will be to convince folks to participate. And then the challenge will be after the election to keep people participating. And that's really important because one of the interesting things that happened after Obama's election was that, I mean, he had a huge grassroots movement backing him. And I think there were like 11 million names on the email list, or 13. I can't remember. I'm always bad with precise numbers, but it was either 11 million or 13. It was just enormous, unprecedented network. And then he got in and just, well, two things happened. One is just kind of didn't mobilize that base, and that base didn't mobilize itself. And people did a lot of, I remember at the time people were doing a lot of, you know, email there. And there were a lot of fights, and a lot of them involved pressuring a couple of Democratic senators or actually pressuring, you know, Susan Collins and Olympia Snowe, you know, but people were just doing it all by email, you know, or signing a petition. It was all invisible. And the Tea Party, fairly soon afterwards, there's a little tiny lag, but pretty quickly afterwards started organizing on the ground. You know, meetings, showing up in public, reaching out to people, being visible and present, and started swinging things back the other way. I mean, you almost got a whiplash from the sort of perceived shift in the country. And then in 2010, those folks really organized and participated. The people who supported Obama mostly stayed home. Not mostly, but enough of them stayed home. And they captured a lot of legislators. There's a lot of money involved as well, of course, or, you know, there always is, but more so since Citizens United, much more so. And, so, you know, and swung it back. And so what I see is, if you say that it just stops when you get your candidate in, then you're not going to achieve what you want. If you continue pushing them, I mean, had those people doing the equivalent of what they were doing around Keystone a year, you know, the first year of Obama's administration, I suspect that we would have had kind of a different historical narrative. You know, and so whatever one's beliefs, I'm one of this young woman who founded Students for Obama on Facebook literally before he ran, as a way to kind of encourage him. You know, she said, you know, your candidate gets in, whoever it is, Obama or anybody else, that's not the end point. That's the beginning. Then you keep working, and you have to. And so I don't honestly know whether, you know, what will happen. But I do think that, you know, that the assumption to say this could be very close and it could depend on what we do for our candidates, whoever they are, is a fairly safe assumption to make. Yeah.
Right.
Hold the button down.
Yeah? Okay. All right. I think today we can say safely that with the Congress under the pressure of all the lobbies and the party establishment's priorities and so forth, and largely people are running running all the time to be elected in the next election cycle. So it's stimulated, for lack of a better word, right now. And we have a candidate that's running that is talking about changing the presidency itself by holding to principles. And I wonder if today there is a need, understanding that the only national elected person that we have as a nation is the president. If there isn't a need now for us to begin to think about how the presidency should evolve to be more provocative, to set the stage for public debate, to begin to move the Congress in ways, because it is tapping into the organizations that you were talking about with Obama, you know, he failed to do, neglected to do, maybe largely because he just fitted into the way the presidency's always been. So I think of FDR coming out during a different period of time. And I wonder if now, given everything, if we shouldn't be looking at what style and what substance and what principles the candidates will bring to the office, how they will change the office itself.
I mean, I think, I guess what I would say is that you look at that, but you also look at, which I think goes back to the previous question, what's the relationship between the candidates and the people that carry them into office, or maybe even the people who oppose them, and what can those folks do? I mean, because if I look at FDR, there were these initially a little bit cautious. I mean, huge visible crisis, and there were these movements that were just pushing him and pushing him and pushing him, and he started doing these things and taking these risks, and pushing through things that might have been inconceivable just, a decade before. But I think it was always in relationship to those movements which were present then, and which, certainly again, just in the last several presidencies, I would say, on both sides, just kind of melted away in terms of really holding them and sort of opening up new space for them to act. So I think there's a tension between the presidents, what the president can do and what they do, and how much they can define the public dialogue. And they can do, they can do a lot. They can do a real lot. And then what people can do to say, yeah, we do need to talk about this issue, and we need to argue it out. And so I think the two feed each other fundamentally. And maybe because it's the part that all of us can have more control over is what we do. And I think that's the part maybe that I focus on, if that makes sense.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
As you said, you've worked with like 300 colleges throughout the country, their political engagement efforts. What are some of the more innovative and effective methods that they have used to get students engaged in politics that you haven't already mentioned?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I'll list that's a good question. And if you do sign the email list, because I'll send you, we have a thing, well, if you want to, it may take a little while because I got to basically, the person who's typing my list is backed up. So, but you'll get on the list and send it. And if you go to campuselect.org or type in Campus Election Engagement Project, you'll go right there and can download. We have this thing called 7 Key Ways to Engage Your Campus. It's sort of this 18-page roadmap broken down by registering, reflecting on issues, getting out to the polls. So kind of in a nutshell, some of them that I really like are, and I would say that the most important thing to do is to start to actually build a team on the campus that spans administration, faculty, student leaders, student organizations, and it's got to be nonpartisan, because if you're reaching out to how to describe it? Individual students can and should be arguing for their preferred candidates. And that's a good thing. That's, and organizing to do that. But a campus as a whole has to be neutral, because it's reaching out to students of different perspectives. But I think you can do that, and so what you do, so the first thing is just you figure. You got to get people. I guess Maine does have enough same-day registration, election day, which is great. I mean, that's just the states that have. And is that new, or has that been for a while? Okay, 30 years. Okay, so I can never remember which ones have it and which don't. So that it's one reason Maine is higher in voting rates than others. So what it means is you still want to register folks, but you also want to remind them, come election day, this is the information you'll need to take to the polls to register, but that you can do it if you've forgotten, and you can change your registration. I mean, and so I would argue in favor of people always registering on campus, or or if you live off campus, but in that community as opposed to I'm from some other state, because you're just much more likely to be able to participate, and and you can participate as a community. So visibility, when you register, visibility where the campus is publicly engaging and making it clear. I mean, so we've had like parades to the polls where sometimes it's the student body president or the president of the school or some students, veterans carrying American flag, and making it a kind of community event. We do nonpartisan. We're going to have them for the presidential races. I don't think there's not a major statewide election for like Senate or governor this term in Maine. So there won't be one of those. But we'll have presidential nonpartisan guides, and also a guide to the impact of the Supreme Court, which to me is probably to be honest, the most significant thing in determining, partly because of the gridlock, who's going to be president, because Supreme Court justices hang around for 30 years, and they're going to, besides Justice Scalia's seat, the odds are overwhelming that there'll be at least one or two additional people who come open in the next 4 to 8 years. And, everything from the election law to, in some sense, the just dismantling of a major part of this Voting Rights Act, they're very consequential decisions. And so we'll do these guides and circulate them and getting people talking. I mean, when they look at, and there's been a lot of studies of what increases voter participation, and conversation is just, even in an electronic age. I mean, so you want to send you want to send out the text and the emails. There's some apps that will circulate where people can kind of have a dialogue via text with their friends about political issues, which is kind of a cool thing. And I just was at a conference, somebody was showing me how it works, and we'll roll that out to the school, all the schools in our network, which would include this one. But the conversations are key. That if people actually talk about the election, much more likely to participate. This was a big school with a football team had, I thought it was pretty cool. They had the whole football team register, and then at halftime they held up their registration cards, and the Jumbotron screen flashed the link of the campus, having a campus voting website where you've got the information. Because when I was asking earlier today in the classes, I did what I often do, which is I just say, how many people, in an election, say, where there was a senator or a governor or a president or congressional representative, where you were eligible to vote potentially, like you were, old enough, but you didn't. And I'd get, up to a third of, about 40% in one of these classes. It's an environmental studies class, actually, which is, you would think to be a pretty concerned class. And a lot of the times people didn't know the information, didn't know where to go, didn't know what to have, were from another state and didn't know they could change it, did it too late, all these things. So having the information is a really big piece of it. But then I think also you have to have that dialogue about, and this sort of goes back to the earlier conversation, that how much that office matters. And, and people have the right to make a purely symbolic vote, but to really think about, the actual differences between candidates, that they will be significant, even as there's some areas that are more blurred that some of us might like. No matter who the candidates are, there will be some very significant differences. And to think which way, to get people to think about and talk about, all right, here's where I stand. I stand with this. Maybe, maybe divide it, go down the list on our checklists. I mean, they have all the issues, sort of tax policy, federal financial aid, climate change, renewable energy, abortion, contraception, immigrant policy. I mean, just, all the foreign policy, all the issues we can think of. And we map out, here they are. And sometimes they converge, but often they don't. And people look at them and they say, oh, okay, I guess there really are significant differences. And sometimes they like candidate A, and sometimes, candidate B on this one, now I'm going back to candidate A. So it isn't like knowing it automatically tells you who to vote for. But what we found is, if somebody said, everybody's lying, everybody's spinning, you can't trust them, they all have handlers. If there was just a list, and we said, oh yeah, we've got this list, and they got really excited. And then this is a school in Minnesota. The next day, I was at a school in Wisconsin where almost everybody had voted in these classes, and I was like, wow, that's really cool. And I said, well, what helped? And they said there was this list in our mailbox. We could see where people stand, and it turned out it was the ones that we'd drawn up for the Senate and presidential races and distributed all the schools in Wisconsin, because it was one of the states we're actively working with. And it just, I think, being able to sort of think through and talk through getting the student newspaper. I mean, students may not read the regular paper, but they sure read the student newspaper. And getting the newspaper to really talk about the differences, to make, to be a vehicle to distribute voting law information, and just to sort of to make it, if you are on a campus, I don't know how to describe it. Well, this is going to sound silly, but it's actually kind of a parallel. It's probably a basic rule of, I don't know, communications, public relations, whatever. If I'm speaking on a campus, I can walk onto the campus, I can look at my schedule and see how much is scheduled, and within 10 minutes, I can see whether there's visibility. I can predict if I'm going to have a good crowd or a crappy crowd. And I'll just know, because it's visible or it's invisible. And if a campus makes that election visible, it will matter. And if they make it invisible and leave it to everybody to be private, folks are much more likely to stay home. So those are a few of those things. But if you go to, again, it's campuselect.org, Campus Election Engagement Project, and you'll see that it says 7 key ways, and you can download it now without waiting for my friend to type it after he finishes the other backed up lists. But it's, we put it, I think we have lessons from 200 schools. I mean, it's from over 5 different election cycles. So it's as comprehensive as we could make it. And then we'll still be coming up with new things. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul.